Good to see everyone here this morning for another worship service at the Church of Christ here in Marlinton. And it's a blessing for us all to be here. We're glad to see we have some visitors, and we hope that you benefit from the worship. We just sung a song a few moments ago, Where the Soul Never Dies, which talks about really what our spiritual destiny is, and whether it will be everlasting life with the Father, or unfortunately the other option is eternal punishment away from God. That eternal destiny is what we're all, or what we should be at least, focused on. And that's why we're here, because I think we are focused on what our spiritual destiny is. This morning, we're going to look back at Numbers 13 and 14. We're going to look back at the beginning, near the beginning. And we're going to see God's people and see that a group of them were a lost generation. They were a generation that lost their spiritual destination. They had a destination and they lost it. And what we need to do with this lesson, with this information, with what we're going to study this morning is, we need to look at this lost generation and then see if we're doing the same thing that made them a lost generation. We need to do some self-examination this morning, and hopefully it will be beneficial to you. As I said, we're going to be in Numbers. We're going to start in Numbers 13 and talk about this lost generation. Now, when I think of the word lost, it's one of those words in our language that grabs our attention and grabs our interest almost immediately whenever we say something is lost. We see all the time about a child or a young person who gets lost. And an entire community, sometimes an entire state, and maybe even the entire nation, focuses on that and conducts a frantic search, a desperate search, because that lost person must be found. The Lord understood how this concept affected us as well. He told of a lost sheep, a lost coin, and a lost son in Luke chapter 15. All of which stories focused on how that item or that sheep or that person was lost, but then was found, and the joy that was experienced when that lost soul or that lost sheep or that lost coin was found. And Jesus taught this to let us know that this is what our attitude should be when someone has been lost and is found. And Jesus said in Luke chapter 19 verse 10 that his mission, he came to seek and save the lost. That was his ultimate goal. A simple mission to search out those who were lost and to help them be saved. Well, this account from Numbers 13 about this lost generation is probably one of the most tragic accounts in the Bible, because an entire generation of God's people failed to enter the promised land because of their own deeds and their own neglect. So let's take a look at this lost generation. And then we need to do some self-reflection to make sure we're not on that same track. Now, leading into Numbers 13, just as a summary, they had been, of course, in slavery in Egypt. God's people had a long period of bondage. God delivered them through Moses. He brought them through the Red Sea in a miraculous fashion. He led them to Mount Sinai and gave them the law, with some missteps along the way, especially that golden calf. But nonetheless, they were given the law. And then they complained that they didn't have anything to eat, that they were hungry, that God sent them out to this wilderness to die. And so then God gave them manna and quail to eat. So he had graciously attended to their needs and led them to the brink of entering the promised land. This is what they were looking forward to. This is where their home was going to be. He told them, your home is not in Egypt under bondage. Your home is going to be serving me in the promised land. We know it as the land of Canaan. And so to reassure them of this promised land of rest, we come here to Numbers chapter 13, and God's going to tell Moses to send out some spies to inspect the land and give their report. I'm going to read starting in verse 1 of Numbers 13. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel, of every tribe of their fathers. Ye shall send a man, every one a ruler among them. And then in the next few verses, he goes through who those men were going to be from each tribe, right? So he gives a list. Numbers, if nothing else, is about a lot of lists. There's a lot of lists and numbers, if you ever read the book of Numbers. But that's what is listed here, and that was important, by the way, to the Jewish people. It was important that they had those lists. Genealogies were important to them. Their history was important. They took records of the things that they had done. It was very important, and God, of course, does this here as well. Now, what is their mission then? What were they to do? These men, we might call them spies, but these 12 men from these separate tribes. Well, in verse 17, it says there, And Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said to them, Get you up this way southward, and go up into the mountain, and see the land, what it is, and the people that dwell therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities be they that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether there be wood therein or not, and be ye of good courage, and bring of the fruit of the land. And now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. So their mission was actually multiple folds here, multiple things that they were required to do. We could probably summarize it by saying this. They were to go up and they were to see the inhabitants, whether they were strong and weak. See how many of them there were. See if there was going to be any opposition, in other words. To check their cities, to see if they're just tent cities, or tent communities, or something of the such like, or where they were actually built up walled cities. They were to look at the land to see what it was. In other words, literally examine it for its fertility and productivity. And other things they were to do. The land being fat or lean refers to that as well, and so on and so forth. So they were to check this land out, right? They were to see what was there and to see if there's going to be any opposition. Now, they all completed their assignment. But then when they began to present their conclusions, the conclusions that they reached, and they offered some recommendations for their actions, that's where some of them went too far. Now, they were told to go back and to report these things, to bring back this information. But, as we're going to see in these reports, they kind of went past making a report of what was there. They started to make some recommendations that was really not within their jurisdiction. This was actually God's decision, not theirs. Now, before we move on here, that's one of the first steps to being lost, or being a lost generation, is that we start to make our own decisions about which path we should go on. And 10 of these spies, we're going to see that they make a decision about what we should do, and they don't consider God in that decision. So if we go down in the chapter to Numbers, or to verse 27, here we're going to see the reports of the spies. And it says here, And they told him and said, We came into the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. And the Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. So we see here that as they're making this report, okay, we can already see that there's some trepidation there. There's some fear. There's a lot of people there. There's walled cities. The Amalekites are there, and the Hittites, and so on, so on, so on. Our enemies are there. They do tell that it is a land flowing with milk and honey. In other words, very prosperous. A very prosperous land. And also that it is fruitful. But again, walled cities, fortified cities. Our enemies are there. Now, in verse 30 it says, and Caleb stilled the people before Moses, said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we be not able to go up against the people, they are stronger than we. And they that brought up an evil report of the land, which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it, it is a land that eateth up its inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw are in it are men of great stature. And we saw there the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, which we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So we have Caleb, who says, well, that might be what's there, but we need to go possess the land. And we see the others reject that and say, no, we cannot go after this land. So, in reality, Caleb and Joshua were the two spies, as we'll see here later on, that said that, yes, we can go take this land. But the others are saying, no, we'll be like ants compared to them, grasshoppers. They're giants. They'll swallow us up. There's so many of them, they'll swallow us up. Now, I'm going to digress for a moment. Bear with me. What I think of is this, is me driving in a large city. I do not like driving in a large city. I am not good at it. I will say that right now. I've been to several large cities. I'm not the greatest at driving in it. I've survived them. And no one else got hurt. But it's not my favorite thing to do. And what I feel like in walking in the big cities, similarly. And I feel like just an ant that's just swallowed up by 100 ants or 1,000 ants or 1,000,000 ants, right? That's the report that they gave. The report that they gave is, they'll just swallow us up. We have no chance. Whereas Caleb and Joshua said, yes, that is what's there. There's a lot of people there, but the recommendations are wrong. We see these obstacles, but we should go possess the city. As we get into Numbers 14, starting in verse 6, it says there, and Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, which were of them to search the land, rent their clothes. And they spake unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we have passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel not against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is depart from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. These reports on what was there was the same, but how they should deal with it was different. Why? All those men, both sides of the aisle, had seen the land, its cities, and its obstacles. But the difference is that the majority, the 10, failed to see the most important element in this, and that is God. They disregarded God's role in this. They were thinking, well, it's just us against them. But no, it would have been the Israelites with God against them, and that's what Caleb and Joshua saw. And that leads us to an important principle. That's going to lead us to the rest of our discussion this morning, and that is that we must include God in our plans. The picture is always brighter if we include God in them. And we can go through some dark times in this world, and we do go through some dark times in this world. But maybe because of physical ailments or a loss of health. Maybe some difficulty in our work life or our finances or in our family life or in our personal life or losing loved ones. There's a lot of dark times. But if we include God in our plans and include God in helping us deal with that, the picture is always brighter. We seem to forget that. Sometimes I think we want to handle things on our own, and that's kind of what these 10 spies were thinking about. They were thinking about handling it on their own. We need to stay away from that land. Caleb and Joshua says, no, we have God on our side. We'll be victorious. So, we have Caleb and Joshua's side. They stayed with God. But what about the others? It led to a lost generation. And we're going to go through some of the reasons here why they were lost, because they listened to the majority. And when they listened to the majority, they were punished by God. They were left in the wilderness, and were told this generation will not enter the promised land. And that's exactly what occurred. That generation from 20-year-olds up would not be allowed to enter. The young people would. But the rest of that generation would not. Let's look at the reasons why they were lost and then apply that to us as self-reflect. First of all, this generation was lost because they drew back. What do I mean by they drew back? Because they had an opportunity to go possess the land and they faltered from that. They wanted to run away from that. They refused to go possess the land. And when that happened, God wasn't with them anymore. He withdrew his promise from them. And he declares to them in Numbers chapter 14, actually starting in verse 36. We won't read all the verses. But what he tells them is this: you're going to wander in the wilderness for a year for each day they had spied out the land. And that turned out to be 40 days. So you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And he tells them in verse 29, actually, of Numbers 14, that your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness. All they that were numbered of you, according to your whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. They were going to die in the wilderness. Just think about that. Just think about what God had done. God had opened a sea for them to walk across on dry land. Now, the Red Sea is not a small body of water. He miraculously opened that up and then had that swallow up on the Egyptians. He brought them to Mount Sinai and gave them the law to live by, even though they built a golden calf and rejected God. And they were punished for that. But he gave them the law. They complained about having nothing to eat, and God gave them something to eat. He has taken care of them all the way. And now they come to this where they're supposed to spy out the land, and they murmured against God again. And he said, you're not going to enter. But they didn't enter because they drew back. They drew back from God. You know, I think sometimes we, in this world, we want our cake and eat it too. We want something for nothing. We live in a something for nothing society, folks. And the way it is with God is, it's not something for nothing. It's we're obedient to him, and then he keeps his promises to us. God always keeps his promises. But we get his blessings when we do what he says. Those blessings, by the way, are not always of this earth. Let me make that clear as well. But nonetheless, that is the way it works. If we draw back, God will draw back from us. I want to read a passage from Hebrews chapter 10. You can turn over there if you want to. But Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 35. It's actually the end of the chapter. Here the writer of Hebrews is going to talk about what happens when we draw back. Cast not away, therefore, your confidence, which hath great recompense of reward. For ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he that shall come will come, and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. But if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. But we are not of them who draw back into perdition, but of them that believe to the saving of the soul. What happened to the Israelites when they drew back is they were not allowed in the promised land. And what happens to us if we draw back is we're not going to be allowed into the promised land of heaven. That's what it says here in these verses. If we draw back into perdition, in other words, if we fall back into sin, we'll be lost. We'll be a lost generation. So drawing back is a bad thing. We have to be courageous. We have to face up to what God has asked us to do and do it, and not draw away from it. Now, here's a second reason why this generation was lost. They were lost because they were satisfied with the majority. They went with the majority. 10 out of the 12 spies said, nah, no way. We're going to be killed. We'll be wiped out. No way. And they rejected the minority report, and really without too much consideration or investigation. It was kind of immediate. Nah, we're not doing it. And they became angry at the opposition. You know, we just read from Numbers 14 a few moments ago where Joshua and Caleb said, look, the Lord delights in us, and if he does, he'll bring us the land, and we'll have this land of milk and honey. That next verse we didn't read, verse 10. It says there, but all the congregations bade stone them with stones. And the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation before all the children of Israel. And then the Lord speaks to Moses about these people. And how long are they going to provoke me? I'm going to smite them with pestilence. In other words, the Lord is angry with them. But what happens here is the majority gets angry with the minority for their opposition. Wanted to stone them. Folks, that happens today when people don't want to go with the majority. What happens in today's world whenever we disagree with the majority? But that's happening everywhere. We can talk about all kinds of examples where the majority is saying, well, this activity is okay. This sin is okay. You need to get with the times, people. That's what they say. But God, amazingly enough, has always been with the minority. And he makes a majority. You see, God makes a majority. But it's very dangerous to follow the crowd, follow the majority, because the minority is often right. We can look in the scriptures and see this. Look at the minority that Noah was. Noah and his 7 family members out of the entire world. Talk about a minority. It was Moses. Yet he was victorious. Elijah and the false prophets of Baal. You remember the story of Elijah whenever the prophets of Baal and he and Elijah had that contest to burn that sacrifice. He stood up against 450 false prophets of Baal. One man against 450. But the one man had God. You know, remember Jesus' crucifixion. Remember whenever Pilate, trying to weasel his way out of the situation he got himself in, says, well, we'll offer Barabbas, and maybe the people may just take Jesus and condemn Barabbas. But Barabbas was the majority, wasn't he? He was spared. It's dangerous to follow the minority, or the majority, I should say. Sometimes follow that crowd. It's dangerous. And this generation was lost because they followed the majority. They listened to the majority. A third reason why this generation was lost. They magnified their difficulties. They made mountains out of molehills. That's a saying that I don't know as many people say in these days and times. But they made mountains out of molehills. They magnified their difficulties. They focused and they concentrated and they fixated on the negative end of the situation. And because they focused on the negativity, they were lost. They saw this land that flowed with milk and honey, and without seeing, they saw the milk and honey, but they focused on the trials and the hardships. And they closed their eyes to the blessings and the opportunities. Let me repeat that. They focused on the trials and the hardships, and they ignored the blessings and the opportunities that were there. They saw giants and walled cities, but they forgot that God was on their side. God in his providence was there. And so because they focused on the negative end of things, they focused on all the reasons why they couldn't take the land, they were forbade to go into the promised land. They lost their inheritance. They lost their spiritual, physical in this case, but also spiritual destination. They lost it. You know, this happens to us whenever we have difficulties. Paul spoke of having a thorn in the flesh. There's all kinds of argument over the years on what that thorn in the flesh is. I don't know what it is. But it was something that was an obstacle to him. But you know what? He said that God's grace was sufficient for him. In other words, the Lord had assured him, you'll be able to overcome this. And that's what happens to us. When we have difficulties and obstacles, if we go with God, and we stay with God, and we follow him, his grace will be sufficient for us. We'll be able to overcome. With every difficulty, God will still make provision for his own. we live in a world that we think we have to do it all ourselves. And boy, when we do it right, we take all the credit. But when something goes wrong, we give all the blame to someone else. But the fact is that we don't have to be on our own. We can follow God and we'll have the greatest advocate that we could ever have. The Lord Jesus Christ will be with us. And with every difficulty, God makes provision for His own. God has said we won't be tempted beyond that which we can bear. God will give us a way out. We may not like the way out. We may have to search for the way out. We may have to study for the way out. We may have to give up some things we don't want to take the way out. But when we have difficulties, God makes provision for us and makes us a way out. The way Paul put it in the letter to the Romans in chapter 8, verse 31 is, he said, if God be for us, who can be against us? Exactly. If God can be for us, no one can be against us. Very famous verse to us. Philippians 4 verse 13 says, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. It doesn't say we can do some things. It doesn't say we can do a few things. It doesn't say we can pick and choose what things. But it says we can do all things. And this generation, back in Numbers, was lost because they lost sight of that. They lost sight that they had God with them. They just focused on the negativity and they just focus on the difficulties. And if we do that, then we're doing what Satan wants us to do, and we're going to fall away from God. If we just focus on our difficulties and our obstacles, that's exactly what they're going to be, as obstacles. And they'll keep us away from God. Here's a fourth reason why this generation was lost. They did not respect themselves. And here's what I mean by that. I think of the phrase in 32 and 33 there of Numbers 13. We were like grasshoppers in our own sight. In other words, compared to them, we were nothing. They had a self-esteem problem. We hear about that a lot in today's time. But the people of Israel here truly had one. They did not respect themselves. They sold themselves short. And when we sell ourselves short, we're going to have great difficulty serving God. We may end up as a lost generation. They should have remembered some things. They weren't exactly a small army. They had over 600,000. 603,500 to be exact, but nonetheless. And when God was with them, they'd never been defeated. Undefeated. The same God who delivered them from Egypt, and that's how many they were numbered whenever they were delivered from Egypt, was still with them. They should have remembered this. Sometimes I think we confuse humility with weakness. And we think because we're humble or because we have to be humble, that makes us weak. And it doesn't. We can be humbly strong. We can have strength in our humility. And not sell God short. We can't cast aspersions on what God has given us. We can't belittle the blessings that God has given us and say, well, that doesn't mean anything. Because God has given us everything. And so they forgot about that. And they saw themselves as not worthy. But with God on their side, they were. But they forgot about that. Here's another reason why this generation, the fifth one, I guess, why they were lost. And it's something that I think we can relate to. And that is that they murmured and turned from authority. They murmured against God and they turned from His authority. They were ready to stone these two spies because they told them something they didn't want to hear. They were going to have an insurrection against Moses and Aaron and against God based on this. When the golden calf was made, they basically had an insurrection there, right? They rejected God's authority. They murmured against Him. They talked against Him. They didn't offer anything constructive. They whined and they bickered and they provoked God So much so that, of course, as we read there in Numbers 14, God says, well, I'm going to take care of this. And he did. But their constant fighting, their constant bickering, their constant rejection of God is an endemic problem that we still have today. When we talk against God and we turn from his authority, we're going to have problems. And our society has done that. And our society has problems, big ones. And as Christians, as the church, we need to do what we can to put a stop to that. To show them the way to God. To show them, no, you don't turn from God. You listen to his authority and you obey it. That's your way out of this. You know, it's very interesting. These Israelites back here, there's a saying in my job, in the school system, which is, and I've said this to many employees that I am supervising. And I'm certainly not the only one who's ever done this. And sometimes it's been told to me. And that is, don't come to us with a problem or come to me with a problem if you don't have a solution. Come up with a solution. The people of Israel here had nothing constructive. No solution. Just, we can't take it. They didn't even look for a solution. They criticized anything offered basically for their own purposes, to better their lives, so they wouldn't have to go fight the fight. And because of that, they were a lost generation. And we'll have the same thing when we turn from God's authority and we murmur against him. The same thing is going to happen to us. Reason number 6, they were looking back and not looking ahead. They looked back to Egypt. Remember, they said, you sent us out here in this wilderness to die. They said that on more than once. They looked backwards and ahead. They actually wanted to go back to Egypt, to slavery. They remembered the experiences of yesterday, and they just would not look to the future. And God's people, folks, have to look to the future. That's what we have to do. The past, yes, we learn from our past. We learn from our mistakes. We hopefully learn a lesson that will help us move on and be better Christians when we make mistakes. But we can't keep focusing on the past and focusing on our mistakes. We have to look forward. We have to look to the future. Luke chapter 9, verse 62, Jesus put it perfectly. He said, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. You know what he's saying there? He's saying you can't look back and long for what was in the past before you're a Christian. You can't long to have all those possessions that you have necessarily. You can't long to have those perhaps sinful activities that you had, sinful relationships that you had. You can't have those things. You have to look forward to the future, to your eternal destiny. And the people of Israel weren't doing that. They weren't looking ahead. Hey, we can take this land and we'll have a promised land. No. They looked backwards, and that's exactly what Satan wanted to do. That's what they did. Here's the last reason. The lesson's going to be yours. God's people ultimately back here at the promised land, were unwilling to pay the price. There was a cost to be reckoned. Yes, there was going to be difficulties. Yes, they may have to battle these people that lived in the land. God was going to be with them, but yes, they were going to have to fight the battle. They were going to have to work. They were going to have to put forth effort. And the cost was reckoned, and that majority there considered it to be too big of a cost. They counted the cost and thought it was too much. Don't know. Maybe they were too soft from just having to go pick up. God put the food on the ground for them every morning. All they had to do was go pick it up. Now, God doesn't make mistakes, but they had it too easy, maybe, in their mind. And they were unwilling to pay the price. We have to be willing to meet the demands of God, folks. And those demands are not always easy. It is not always a rosy path being a Christian. We know that. We know there are difficulties. There are things we have to give up that maybe we don't want to give up. There are things we have to do that maybe are not desirable. But God has his demands, and we have to be willing to meet them. And we have to be willing to count the cost and pay the price. Not count the cost and run away, like the people of Israel did back here. We have to be willing to count the cross. Remember, Jesus said in Luke 14, verse 27 and following, he said, "Whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." He makes it very clear to him. And then he talks an example about a man who's going to build a tower. And he says, who of you would go build a tower or a large building or a large structure? It would not count the cost and see if you have the money and the resources and the materials to finish it. When he asks that question, it's a rhetorical question. The obvious answer is no one's going to do that. No one's going to not count the cost. And he tells them, you have to count the cost of being a Christian. Verse 33 down there in Luke 14, down further, he says, "Whosoever be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath cannot be my disciple." In other words, there's things we have to give up. There's a cost to being a disciple. And we have to be willing to pay it. And the people back here in this lost generation were not willing to pay it. And if we aren't willing to pay it, we will be among the lost generation. The same thing will happen to us spiritually if we're unwilling to meet the demands of God. And his demands, although we may not like them, are not anything that we can't do. Every person on earth can obey the gospel. Every person on earth can believe that Jesus is the Son of God and what he did for us. He died and was buried and was resurrected for us. Everyone can believe that. Everyone can repent of their sins and turn from their sins. It may not be easy. It may be hard. It may cause uncomfortable situations for us and uncomfortable conversations for us. And it may cause us to give things up. But it can be done. Each one of us can confess with our mouth our belief in Jesus, the Son of God. We can confess that belief in some form. And each one of us can be buried with him in baptism and immersed for the forgiveness of our sins. And we can all live faithfully unto death the best that we can because we have a rule book. We have a guide. We have a path. And we can all do it. There's no reason for us to be part of a lost generation. But if we don't apply these lessons to ourselves and we're not mindful of the warnings given to us, then we'll be part of that lost generation. We need to be very careful. Let's not be part of that lost generation. If you're not here as a Christian, we ask that you obey the gospel and be immersed for the forgiveness of your sins. But if you are a Christian, and perhaps you've gone the way of the majority, don't be in that lost generation. You can come out of it. We talked about the fact that God gives us a way out. He gives us a way out. And he still gives us a way out. If you're a Christian and you've fallen away, you have a way out. You can come back to him in repentance and asking for forgiveness. And we'll pray with you and for you if that needs to be done in a public way, which is why we offer this invitation. If you have a need in any way, come as we stand as we sing.